get into because you can always find some unhappy noble to help you,
Yeah.
but way, way harder to hold afterwards. You can't satisfy all those powerful nobles, and you can't easily get rid of them all.
So decentralized power is harder to keep control of.
Much harder. He notes the Romans only really secured Greece long-term by dismantling the city-states and getting rid of the local ruling families.
Which brings us to his advice on cities that were used to being free, republics. His advice here is pretty stark.
Yeah, this really shows his pragmatic, sometimes brutal side.
Hmm.
For a city used to liberty, used to its own laws, he says there are only two sure ways to hold it.
Okay.
You either ruin it completely, or you go and live there yourself.
Ruin it. Just destroy it. That seems extreme.
Machiavelli argues that people used to freedom never forget it. They never forget their old ways, no matter how well you treat them later. The memory of liberty, he says, it's always there, like a spark waiting to ignite.
Especially in republics.
Especially republics. They have more vitality, he thinks, more hatred for the conqueror, more desire for revenge than states used to being ruled by a prince. He uses Pisa constantly resisting Florence as his example. Because that desire for the old freedom is so strong, so persistent, he concludes the safest way, harsh as it sounds, is just ruin.
Wow. Okay. That's a chilling perspective on what security might require. Let's shift to something else he considers absolutely central: military power.
Ah, yes. This is probably his most famous idea. Machiavelli says a prince should have, literally, no other object, nor thought, nor art, but war. War and how to organize it.
That's it. That's the main job.
It's the only art that truly matters for a ruler, he argues. Essential for keeping your state. Essential if you want to gain power in the first place.
And we touched on it, but he really, really dislikes mercenaries.
Hates them. Sees them as totally useless and actively dangerous.
Why so bad?
They fight for money, not loyalty. They're ambitious, undisciplined, faithless. In peacetime, they just cause trouble and drain your money. In wartime, they'll run away or betray you. He flat out blames Italy's weakness and invasions largely on using mercenaries. He even describes a French invasion as basically a war of chalk, implying the mercenaries offered no real resistance.
Just marking where they needed to go. Okay, what about auxiliary troops? Soldiers sent by an ally?
Even worse, Machiavelli says, more dangerous than mercenaries.
Really? Why?
Because auxiliaries are a unified force. They're disciplined. And they're loyal.
Yeah.
But to someone else, their own ruler. So if they lose the battle for you, you're left exposed. But if they win for you, you become their prisoner, basically. You're now dependent on the power who sent them. He points to Pope Julius II needing Spanish troops, then having to be bailed out by the Swiss, or Florence using French help against Pisa and ending up dangerously under France's thumb.
Okay, so no mercenaries, no auxiliaries. Where does the prince get his army?
Only one place, from his own state. Troops made up of his subjects, his citizens, his dependents. Machiavelli is crystal clear on this. These are the only secure forces.
Own troops or nothing.
Pretty much. A state that relies on hired or borrowed soldiers is fundamentally weak. Its survival depends on luck or someone else's good intentions, not its own strength, not its own virtue.
You just used that word, virtue. We mentioned earlier that people sometimes misunderstand Machiavelli because of translation. The source notes virtue meant more than just virtue in the moral sense for him. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, that's really, really crucial for understanding him. When Machiavelli talks about virtue, he's generally not talking about being pious or morally good in the way we might think.
So what is it?
It's closer to
Mm-hmm.
effectiveness,
Yeah.
capability, manliness, skill, drive, ingenuity, valor, political strength. It's that quality that lets a leader grab opportunities, overcome challenges, achieve his goals, especially when things are tough.
Mm-hmm.
It's about competence and forcefulness in the real world of politics.
Ah, okay. So when he says a state without its own army lacks virtue, he means it lacks its own power, its own ability to act effectively and defend itself. Not that it's immoral.
Exactly. It lacks the internal means to be effective and secure. And he uses history to back this up.
Example.
This era Borgia, yes. His power shot up once he ditched mercenaries and used his own men. Jerome II in ancient Syracuse got rid of his mercenaries, fought with his own citizens. David, facing Goliath, used his own sling, refused Saul's armor. It's a metaphor for using your own strength. Charles VII of France, building French power by creating national troops. A policy his son, Louis the Elephant, stupidly reversed by going back to Swiss mercenaries.
And he thinks using outside troops actually weakens you over time.
Yes, he argues it hollows out your own military ability. He points to the fall of the Roman Empire. When did it start? When they began hiring Gothic mercenaries. They basically outsourced their military virtue, their strength, to foreigners and made themselves weaker.
So the prince needs his own army. And even when there's no war, he should still be focused on military matters.
Absolutely. Constantly. Machiavelli insists the prince must dedicate himself to studying war, even in peacetime.
What does that involve?
Studying military history, understanding geography, especially his own lands, staying fit, maybe through hunting, which also teaches you the terrain, and imitating great leaders from the past.
Imitating past greats. Who does he mention?
Alexander the Great looking to Achilles, Caesar looking to Alexander, Scipio Africanus looking to Cyrus, based on Xenophon's writings.
And it's not just battle tactics they should imitate.
No, it's broader. Courage, discipline, sure, but also qualities like chastity, being approachable, humanity, liberality. Understanding the whole package, a leader needs to command respect and inspire his troops. Peacetime is for preparing your mind and body, building up that virtue so you're ready when fortune turns against you.
That connection between military readiness and these other seemingly non-military virtues is really interesting. It's about cultivating the complete leader, that broader idea of virtue.
Yes, exactly. Building the personal and strategic toolkit needed to be a strong, effective ruler and commander.
Okay, let's turn to how a prince should generally behave. Machiavelli famously says a prince has to learn how not to be good. This really feeds that negative image, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. But again, you have to see the context. He's not saying go be evil. He's analyzing how rulers are actually judged and what is necessary to survive and succeed in the political jungle as he saw it.
So good qualities in normal life might be bad for a ruler.
They can be ruinous, yeah.
Eh.
And sometimes things seen as vices are actually essential for security. A prince needs to know when to be conventionally good and when not to be, depending on what the state needs, what keeps him in power.
He contrasts specific qualities. Let's start with generous versus miserly. You'd think being generous is good for a prince, right?
Yep.
Build goodwill.
Sounds good, yeah. A reputation for being liberal, generous. But Machiavelli says it's a fast track to ruin.
Ah.
To keep it up, you have to spend huge amounts of money. Eventually you run out, then what? You have to tax your people really heavily to get more money, and that makes them hate you. So trying to be generous leads to poverty and hatred.
Okay, so what about being miserly or parsimonious? That sounds bad.
Initially, maybe. But Machiavelli argues it lets the prince manage his money properly. He can defend the state, fund projects, without having to bleed his people dry with taxes. And over time, when people see his frugality means they aren't being heavily taxed, and he can afford armies or defenses when needed, they start to see him as generous to them because he's not taking their money. He points to successful rulers like Pope Julius II, the King of France, King of Spain. They used being careful with money to build strength.
That's a very practical, almost economic argument, not a moral one. What about cruel versus merciful? Surely mercy is always better.
Well, a prince should want to be seen as merciful, definitely. But he has to be careful that his mercy doesn't lead to chaos or let things fall apart. Sometimes, Machiavelli argues, a bit of calculated cruelty is necessary to keep everyone united and loyal.
And this leads to his most famous, maybe most controversial argument.
The big one. It's better to be feared than loved if you can't be both.
Better feared than loved. That goes against everything we usually hear about leadership. Why does he say that?
It comes down to his view of human nature. He basically says love is held together by obligation, a bond that men, because men are bad, he says, will break whenever it's in their self-interest to do so.
Okay, so love is unreliable.
Very. But fear is maintained by the dread of punishment. And that, he argues, is a much more constant, reliable motivator.
So he's working from the assumption that people are fundamentally self-serving